Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is another video taking a critical look at web frameworks. And the reason I'm kind of getting back on this subject is an idea that I saw in a video, and it was brought up by Casey Muratori. Uh, my sincerest apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Is that maybe some of the popularity of AI tools in web front-end development is that you can wrangle all this tooling and unnecessary complexity required just to make a website using this stuff. And some of that doesn't exist in other development environments because the tool chains are completely different. And so before we get more into that, I just kind of want to talk about a little bit of the scale of what people view web programming as. First, this thing where you have the all-out advocates that say you can't get better than certain frameworks. You have the vast majority of people trying to get things to work. And then you have people who are saying, well, this is the worst thing ever happened to UI programming. I wish the browsers never existed. And I'm a little bit more towards this is pretty bad. And that partially is colored by my experiences now with having programmed in the past, but now much more so about how basically web-based applications work, or in my case, don't work very well. So first of all, I'm going to start off by taking a look at it. And I went back to it and said, well, the tooling, is it really that bad? And I decided to do a little bit of experiment to just jump into it and start with React and see where it goes. And the first choice that popped up was really interesting looking at the documentation. Is like, are you sure you don't want to use a framework? And what made that interesting to me was that I think a lot of people are going to be designing these web applications in an environment in which their hosting environment or their backend is already set. And a lot of these frameworks are very opinionated on where you host them and how you host them. And so that was interesting. Not only that, but looking a little bit more into it, it's a little bit harder to see how you can host these things where everything is like really strict. And that might be a thing that comes up to some people where it's like, hey, I want to use React, but the way we serve files, that is set in stone. We're not changing that part of our environment. That's a much bigger discussion. We can't have it. I was under the impression that I could use these tools as a way to enhance my HTML pages, right? And I use web APIs, and we have a way of doing that. The backend guys are working on that too. But I can't just say, oh, we should host this, or we can use Docker for this, or Kubernetes for that. I can't make that decision. That's already been made for me. So it's interesting then to put that there up front. And not only that, but given that some of the things like Next.js are increasingly tied to a hosting company, there's some interesting complications there. But they also have some documentation saying, oh, you want to start this project from scratch? This is how we can do this. So putting aside the framework thing for now, I started from scratch. So the first thing I did is I went off and I looked at it and I said, oh, there's a NPM package called Create React that will do the template thing for you. Then I did some more searching and found out that that tool had been depreciated and that it had been replaced. And here's some options that you have. And it gave me three. You can use Vite, you can use Parcel, you can use RS Build. And again, I was like, okay, looked at all of them, couldn't really tell what the differences were, all that kind of stuff, and didn't want to get too much into it because I kind of wanted to move a little bit forward, but ended up with RS Build, frankly, because it's one of those things where, it's using Rust, and I don't have Rust in my environment yet and want to do some stuff with that. So maybe I'll learn a little bit how to do that. So yeah, and it was fairly easy to do with, just put cargo in and you're fine. So that was good. And so that was really interesting to me. Of course, what's really also interesting is that people that are doing tooling are increasingly not using TypeScript for doing it. And so they're not self-hosting as people do in other languages. And that's really interesting. And as you know, that not only true for some of these build tools, but it's also true for the TypeScript type checker itself, which is being ported from TypeScript to Go, just so they can get the performance to work in a certain way. And there's lots of videos out there on why they made that choice. And so what this kind of popped down to is that, well, what are these build tools doing? And they're responsible for minifying things, but also really making sure that your modules are basically packaging things up in a module way. And the ECMA script, which is the kind of the official name for JavaScript, does have a standard for these modules. It does seem to be the one that everybody uses. There was an older one for a while, and I can't tell if there's still needs for backwards compatibility there. But now I was getting back to it and looking at what these builders did. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Why isn't Webpack still not a thing? because when I was first starting out, people were pretty excited about Webpack, and why it's not on the list. And apparently, it's one of those things where they had a lot of performance issues, and if they were able to overcome them, they were not able to overcome them in time for alternatives to come along and take over. And I was like, but 3 new choices, that seems like something that's a little bit crazy. And not only that, but I found out there's also ES Build, but I can't tell if ES Build has gone the same way as Webpack has in terms of just not being very useful. So, and I'm assuming that these 3 choices are in essence interchangeable. So, who knows? And the second thing we got into, and this was a much easier choice, even though I do enjoy the Visual Studio environment. I know the vast majority of people are going to be using VS Code for this, and there's certain people that are going to, for those IntelliJ folks out there, they're going to be using WebStorm. I'm going to assume that those have various mixed experiences. But if someone told me that actually it's really good in Visual Studio, I wouldn't be too surprised. If someone told me that, the people at IntelliJ did a really good job with it, I would completely believe that too. So, excuse me, not IntelliJ. The people at JetBrains, which also make IntelliJ, they made a really good web API IDE. I completely believe that. I would have not a hard time believing that at all. So I'm just going to stick to VS Code, not use some of the VS Code forks that are more AI oriented, because it wasn't using the AI stuff. The other thing that happened now is there's a little bit detour that swerved off here again. Is like, well, what happened to the NPM? All right. I mean, I know I have to use Node for some of this stuff. Well, it turns out, okay, the performance for Node is not so great. I'm like, great, I get that, I understand that. So there's some alternatives. It seems like this PNPM is gaining some ground in terms of how it uses the file system. And since on Windows, there's a lot of people recommending that because it uses some things that Windows does have that NPM assumes that Windows doesn't, and that actually can help things a lot. And I was surprised I made a pretty large YAML file in my project, but that is what it is. The second problem I bumped into when I was trying to do some development, and what I've gotten too used to, maybe some people say you've gotten too used to this, but what I was used to in the environments before was auto completion. Now, that being said, it is way better than it has been in the past. I mean, light years better. And so there's a lot of improvements there. And so I'm not going to try to harp on the people in the web environment saying, well, guys, you need to do like really good at this. No, there's much better experiences over all of that. Thanks to TypeScript, thanks to things like language servers and language server protocol and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff there. That being said, because of the overall models and how JavaScript kind of works and how the environments work, there are some real limitations here. For example, when I was in a TSX file, it would suggest certain tags to me, and it'd pop up certain components. And I'm like, oh, that's really great. It knows about all this stuff. That's really cool. Not sure where this came from, but okay. It seems to be defined somewhere. And I would pop it in, and then all of a sudden it'd be like, well, you can't put it there. And I was like, well, the language server is telling me I can't do this, but why did the language server assume I could use it there in the first place when it suggested me for autocomplete? So there is some pretty big hiccups, and I'm sure it's because that one part doesn't see the other part, and you have to actually put the thing in there, and then it has to look at it and say, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense because you can't put it this there, so on and so forth. And of course, there's limitations here because you don't want to take it to the point where the language server has to literally go off, recompile everything, run it in a specialized sandbox just so it can do reflection and figure things out. That's just not going to work because what you're handing it to is not necessarily going to be a program that's completed. It's going to get a syntax tree with bugs in it. You can't just go off and assume it's a working program. So this is tricky. That being said, the environments I'm used to have way better autocomplete, even for things like, oh, I want to do a desktop application, even for that. So just be aware of that. The third problem, again, and this is, again, from the other environments debugging was kind of usable, but still really rough. And not only, but I'm not surprised by that at all, given the whole, you have to go from a TSX to, I assume, what is a TSX, TS plus other thing files, which ultimately is turned into JavaScript and some HTML and some CSS. So there's lots of steps that go on there, and I see why you need tools to do that and then bundle them back up. That being said, overall, it's really frustrating to deal with. And making that better, there's going to be a couple things. One is that there's more and more work on the debug application protocol, which, like a language server protocol, makes it so that you can have a common way of having third-party processes that allow you to debug programs. So you can plug in existing debugging environments, like you could plug in existing language server environments. And that could help a lot with this, so that you could eventually make connections up so that you can steer Chrome debugging and get information from the Chrome debugger as you need it. So, and I'm sure that there's probably people that have already set that up already and it's working. I just couldn't figure out how to get it working from the top of my hat when I was getting on top of this. So back to this idea that Casey had put up about AI and how the tooling might affect the adoption of it. I completely agree with this. It's an excellent point. I think it's one of those things where it's useful to point out, because what is interesting to me that I think in the long term is that I don't think that a large language model is the only way to do this, nor is it even close to the best way of actually doing this. But I get it. It's one of those things where people are kind of using LLMs as this kind of basically this wizard that you throw text into and you get code out of. And it does a pretty good a job of that. But it's one of those things where it doesn't necessarily beat a template or a set of tools that can solve the specific problems that people are doing over and over again, especially since AI can't learn from what it's done. It just will keep doing the same things over and over and over and over again. So on that, I'm going to go into an intermission about some of the ideas that are much more closer to what this channel usually talks about. And I'm talking about typing and object-oriented programming. Some things which TypeScript adds some stuff to, but ultimately JavaScript doesn't do. Now, JavaScript does have types, but it's much more dynamically typed. And the way it's dynamically typed can be actually fairly frustrating. And it certainly has objects, but it doesn't really have anything that would approach what I would call traditional object-oriented programming in multiple contexts. And I'll talk about this. The reason this is interesting is that use of object-oriented programming languages for desktop GUIs has a long history, and overall it's worked very well. In fact, a lot of the features in object-oriented programming use and their adoption went hand in hand within the increasing demand for desktop GUI applications in Windows or on the Macintosh, and later Windows and Mac OS, or even some X environments like KDE and GNOME. All of these things, they built on top of these object-oriented programming languages for this kind of stuff. And the reason they did that is it worked very, very well. One, when you initially did this, you need to be high performant. And two, the C++ for classes, class hierarchies and subclassing really works well for certain types of things. If you want to do a button in a GUI and you just slightly want to change its lookout or just change one or two things of its behavior, if you can just subclass and override one or two methods, that is an excellent way of doing things versus trying to do hooks and doing all these other types of different ways that people do this to try to access just enough of the functionality that you want to override. That's an excellent example of this. It's actually one of the main motivators, to be perfectly honest, behind why inheritance exists in C++. If you look at the design patterns book, it is talking about the patterns they use to create an actual GUI cross-platform toolkit. So it's one of those things that these things have hand in hand. And I want to point out that tools like Chromium, the browser that you're running things on, has been built with C++ and these types of languages in mind. And I haven't seen anybody suggest with any sense of credibility that one could rewrite and build a browser in TypeScript, and that actually would be an advantage. That you could bootstrap React to make a React Native application that's a browser that can run React. I don't think anybody would really see that as being very sensible or a good use of time. So this first crux of web development is that all these features that have been proven themselves useful time and time again in desktop programming, GUI programming, are not available for front-end developers. And that is a hard problem. And why I call it the crux is that all development teams will have to solve how they address this crux and get over it to move on. It's one of those things where it is something that you ultimately have to deal with to get any sort of progress. It is something that is in your way, and it's just something you just cannot move out of the way or ignore. The interesting thing about this is some of you will be aware that this channel has a lot of videos on the Racket programming language, and that's the vast majority of what I'm doing on this channel, which is, some of you will be like, well, that is a dynamically typed functional programming language, which is absolutely true. And it seems like you shouldn't be protesting too much when people are like in Racket and TypeScript really trying to push this more functional paradigm forward than, these really traditional C++, not functional languages at all. And there's a couple of replies I have to that, which is this is correct. But again, one of the weaknesses of those functional languages was these GUI programs, the kind of programs that more and more businesses and people were trying to develop. Lisp just not did not do a very good job in that regard. It really didn't. Um, there was things like Smalltalk, which did a much better job of it, which Objective C and ultimately Next Step, and then what became Mac OS 10 borrowed from. And then you had C and C++ on the other side with Windows that Linux ultimately borrowed from in terms of building stuff on top of the core X libraries. You had things like Motif and later on KDE, and then you have QTE, all these other libraries. So that is a historical weakness of functional programming, and the reason being is that GUI programs are just stateful. They change state all the time. They have a lot of global state. They manipulate a lot of state, and they change state constantly. And so that is something that programming languages, by design, try to abstract away and use as little as possible of. And I will point out that Racket, because of this, adopts its own class-based paradigm. It's a little bit more based on the Smalltalk dynamic dispatch Objective-C model than the straight C++, because that makes a little bit more sense. They've made their own GUI toolkit out of this, and it is useful. Like I said, Dr. Racket uses that toolkit itself to bootstrap itself, so Dr. Racket is written in Racket. But even Racket, that toolkit has some limitations compared to the other ones as well. And if I was going off and telling people, hey, I wanted to build up a really big GUI, robust desktop GUI thing, that would not be on my first choice for lots of reasons, obviously. The second crux of front-end development is, again, something that you will fundamentally have to overcome and deal with, is that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript have been stretched to support web applications. And by stretched, you're seeing the seams, where this came from lightweight interactivity of a web page all the way to insanely interactive web pages. And not only that, but some of the things that CSS has done and how you change it to deal with this kind of world, there's some stretches there. Frankly, one of the things about people talk a little bit more about this is that when you're looking at a world where you have an application that's set up of which is a bunch of components, this whole idea of a cascading style sheet is actually much more harmful than it is useful, because it's one of those things where it just ends up doing what you not want to do, which is basically propagate a style sheet down and try to override in various places, versus being able to just go up and saying, okay, by default, what would you want me to do? And then I override it over levels. And then they're adding a lot of things onto CSS to make it, frankly, just a lot more complicated. There's some things in there that basically tie it. So you have pseudo states, you can have your own extra defined properties, lots of crazy stuff that's going on there, lots of evolution. And again, it's to try to be able to build up for what people are doing this and supporting it and having to stretch the environment for it to try to, be in that, to try to support those types of things. But this is the fundamental problems that the coders have to accept if you're in this environment, or worse, they refuse to see it, which is basically none of these frameworks, none of these libraries are going to patch over all these seams and gaps. If they had, and the reason being is I'd say this is that if it really was possible, it would have been done by now. And it still is an issue. You still see all these hiccups. You still have all these problems. You still haven't gotten much further in terms of being able to reuse components on a web page. It's just kind of been very stagnant. And the fact is that, well, because there really hasn't been any big breakthroughs in this kind of a platform environment that allow people to move forward. And it's going to always be fundamentally harder for people to do this because of the unneeded complexity. And the only thing I'll say here is that, you can say this. You can say that I have skill issues about React. That's perfectly fine. I will accept that. But stop dismissing coders that are doing the day-to-day work in this environment with real issues as just having skill issues. That's not fair. And it's not professional. So, okay, great. You talked on for a bit about how this web development is really tough and tricky, and probably didn't say anything that was really all that different, but how would you go about fixing it? Since it's really easy to point out the problem, why could you be part of the solution? And obviously, I have my own ideas, but it would be opinions, and it'd be very hard to get going in this current environment. And that's what it is. Having good ideas is one thing. Getting people to agree around good ideas and making them happen, that's a whole another ballgame. But there's some alternatives that I can talk about that are worth looking at. One of the things that you can do is that given on your domain and what you're targeting, you can really do, for example, what I call mobile native web light. And what I mean by web light is that do much more of what we did way back in the day, which is have a lot more of the logic for rendering pages and spitting them out be moved all the way on the server, and use things like HTMLX to make sure that you're just not reloading the entire page when everything happens, and making these web light things kind of be able to do most of the stuff that you want to do on the web page, but really for the full on interactivity, you would go to the mobile app. My best example of this would be Instagram. You can go to Instagram and look at people's photos, but you can't really make new photos, can't do all the filters, can't all the on the desktop. You really only do it on the mobile thing. The other one too that actually would be interesting for some people is take a look at desktop native and maybe web light. There are some people I think that would be served. Their market would be very served by coming up with a very good desktop application and maybe a light web version of it. That being said, that does give you into the difficulties of cross-platform development, potentially, and it's harder to find people that do C there. I'll put a little plug for C# Maui, which actually has some promises there. But again, that's more likely. The third one, which I think is much more of a dark horse, but is actually much more applicable than people think, is that there are a lot of web developers, and I do mean a lot of them, that are literally developing web applications for an environment in which the only machines that are accessing those applications are Windows machines that are managed by that enterprise. And to go through all that hassle just basically, there's no reason for it. If you can make a desktop application in that environment, it's going to work better. IT will have a ways of making sure that it gets installed on all the machines. Those desktop applications can keep themselves updated. All that technology is there. You do not need to use the web in that environment. And that's where I think a lot of web applications and web development that's basically stuck in the quagmire could really do, and look back and saying it's like, you know what, everybody that's going to be using this is going to be a Windows machine. Now, I think the reason that this doesn't happen and people don't look at this more seriously is because they look down upon those jobs as being beneath them, and they want to, they don't want to run Windows, and they want to use Linux, and they want to use the Mac OS, and that makes a blind spot for people that are doing desktop development. And I would say that one of those things about it is that it might be something that becomes more of a, may not be the greatest, but it might be something that you can make a solid career out of. I certainly had a great career of doing C# programming, and I worked more on the back end, but I had some successes working with people on desktop applications beforehand. And there's a lot of environments and enterprises that use that stuff, and they're good jobs, and you're just not dealing with all these vagaries. So that's an interesting dark horse there. Again, because Apple hardware is really cool, and some people really do like Mac OS is fine, and some people, they just want to use Linux and they just don't want to deal with it. And so if you want to really get out to as many people as possible, then you have to kind of deal with the web. Okay, so given that would be the longer term for fixing up the web, which is basically what I would do, is that make WASM the default. And what WASM started out with is a way of doing certain types of things that the core JS engines couldn't do, and go a step beyond to some of the things that we're trying to, like inscript them and all these types of stuff, that try to make it so that you could do certain lower level operations much quicker than you could in JavaScript. The thing about it though is that it's ultimately designed that you could make it so that you could embed WASM and run WASM within the JavaScript engine, and instead of doing it the opposite way, which was basically the JS engine is basically a subset of what you can do with the WASM. All right. And the thing about it is that people looked at this and said, well, I don't want to make a complete model for inheritance and all this kind of stuff. And we kind of have to do this because we have to kind of have a way of doing this so we can have modules interoperate. I kind of disagree with this. I don't think the interlanguage module thing is as much as an issue versus having a standard set of interfaces and structs to interact with in terms of the browser. So that's what WASM needs to define, and that's already defined in some sense. And so what you really need is you just need records and interfaces. You just need a different version of the DOM, and not the existing DOM, by the way. You need a different set of abstractions to access the underlying browser capabilities. So that would be the other way I would solve it, is literally put WASM in the front seat, and then adapt a much more broader set of abstractions around threads, first class events and custom events, and how you do things like marshaling between the UI context and background workers. Make that stuff a little bit more obvious, how you can do that kind of stuff, and that could really solve a lot of problems, I think. And in that case, what you do is you really need to make web components happen, make them happen, and make them much more in the um, idea of how we had components in the past from ActiveX and COM and other environments where they're reusable and embeddable and have a certain set of standard interfaces for around that. And the thing about it is that in this case, do not worry about trying to make them backwards compatible with the DOM. And this is the fundamental break is that that's what React tries to do. Ultimately, if you want to do a web application, you need to do a web application from the very start. And so the long-term way to fix this would be that HTML web applications or single page applications or whatever you want to call them is you have an option that literally starts out with HTML blah, 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 app. And app is a component that basically expects a bunch of other components to live underneath it that will lay out and it will ultimately create instances of, and then ultimately recreate, lay out, and display the application there. So much like other languages use markup, Swift, C#, so on and so forth, that it literally takes this, uses it to instantiate an object graph, and then runs it to, that's the application, that's the GUI. And then what you do is that you have a certain built-in components for the lowest level types of things that you need. Things like boxes, grids, boxes, labels, buttons, text, isolated HTML. In older desktop applications, you used to have a rich text component that you could use the whole rich text format before RTF really didn't become a thing. So one of the things that could become standard is like, oh, this is a markdown component. And so inside it, just render this markdown and do it in the component way so that you basically the component, its layout can be controlled by a grid, or it's told to be, change its properties by events or having things called on it, and do it all that. Basically do it like all these desktop applications work, is have these things, everything, do it as an application would do it. And don't try to just cram it into how HTML wants to lay out things, and let the HTML layout engine work more toward minimally interactive pages that are rich with text and images and limited interactive elements. And everybody's going to be more happy. And that's not that hard to do, because basically it's one of those things where it's like they're 90% of the way there anyway. It's not that much more difficult for them to just create a better engine for doing this kind of stuff. The reason that they haven't, and the thing about it is that what I'll say is that by doing this, the major player around Chrome and browsers, Google, loses some control over how applications are delivered and therefore how people interact mainly with their computer. And they don't want to give that up because they wonder if they gave these capabilities to people, if they might not just do full-on cross-platform desktop applications, skip the browser part entirely, go something to like what they do with Chrome, basically Chromium applications, and just start doing that much more often. And then also allowing things for the individual OSs like Windows and Mac OS to provide much better, more native-like ways for running those applications that don't involve a browser at all. And so I think that's actually where the main problem in web development lies, is that fundamentally the main player, and who is a bunch of very smart people. Chromium is an excellent project, but their bills are paid by a company that wants to make sure that every interaction that you have on the web, as many of them go through their browser and their technology as possible, because that's how they make their money. And so ceding some of that space back to the players like Microsoft and Apple would be a bit of a stretch for them. And that can be why maybe there is some resistance there. So that's interesting. We'll see how that plays out. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.